good.
Hey folks, Miguel Iturrate back here on the MMA Museum podcast, and I've got an extra special treat, especially for the hardcore fans out there. This man here has been around the game practically since the very beginning, if not at the beginning. A original Lions Den member, moved on to AKA. Didn't have a long fight career, but he moved on to do a lot of influential things as a manager, as a matchmaker, as a enabler, as a training partner and stuff. And this is Crazy Bob Cook. Bob Cook, and I'm glad to see you again, Bob. Good to meet. Good to catch up.
Likewise, it's been a long time, and yeah, it's I think it's probably been about 10 or so years since we've had a chance to talk. So
it might
sure
be
we'll
closer to 15. You know,
might be 15. You know, time flies. I think I've been in this business at least 25 or 27, or I don't even know.
Yep,
You know,
yep.
a lot of these guys were 17 and now they're 40. It's like, how'd that happen?
Yeah, entire careers have gone. Like Chelsea, I just read today that Sonnen fought John Jones 11 years ago. I was like,
yeah,
that was like, you know, time does fly, Bob. But look, you know, they called him Crazy Bob, and we were going over some things, and I know some things about Bob, and one of the things is that he's definitely not crazy, not in that way that you think he is. You know, where like you meet crazy guys that party, or they're doing this stuff. Bob was always extremely professional, very serious. Bob, why don't you tell people first how you got the name Crazy Bob, so people can, right there, I think that sums up how dedicated you've been to the sport ever since.
Well, I don't know that I would qualify today, but back then I was dedicated to learning and improving my skills, and I was lumberjacking up in the Sierras, and it took me a while to find it, but I finally found the Lion's Den. And so I would work all day and come down there and train at night. And then later on, Frank moved down to AKA in San Jose with Javier Mendez, and I started coming down to train with Frank. So I was going both places until the Lions Den moved down to San Diego, and then I switched completely over to American Kickboxing Academy. So at that time, I would work, cut timber falling all day, jump in my truck, drive down to San Jose, which was at least a 3-hour drive, depending on where I was leaving from, and then train for a couple hours and then drive back. So it made for a rough day the following day. So Frank was like, "That's you're crazy," and that became the moniker Crazy Bob for the driving that I was doing at the time.
So you were doing basically a super hard physical job, because dropping timber is not for everybody. You know what I mean? And then driving 6 hours total commute is.
Well, it was 6 hours plus 2 hours training, so it was an 8-hour day after working all day.
Yeah, so that's how you get a name like Crazy Bob. So, this is circa 1998 that you had your first fight. When did you actually go to the Lions Den and find them, dig them out?
I think that was probably about a year or so before my first fight.
Okay.
I went to a bunch of different gyms, and I came from a traditional martial arts background. I grew up doing it. My dad was originally in like Ed Parker black belt. My grandfather was a boxer. So I grew up in martial arts, and then like I think so many other people, I saw the first UFC, and I was like, I've got to learn this realistic. This is what's real here. It's not theory. And it started my journey towards trying to learn and find a place. I went to several different schools, and I walked into the Lions Den, and I was like, everybody in here can kick my ass. This is exactly where I want to be.
Okay.
And
so what was the Lions Den? Who was there? Because by 97, 96, 97, Ken was already kind of.
Ken wasn't really there much at all. It was Frank, Jerry,
Pete Williams.
Vernon, Pete, Mikey Burnett, Joe Williams, trying to think who else, but they everybody treated me great, and I wasn't, when I was going to the Lions Den at the time, I was a student. I wasn't necessarily a fighter for them at that point in time. I was a student just there to learn, and it was an impressive room at the time.
Sure, no, for sure. Now they talk about that Lions Den tryout with based on the Japanese style of the 500 squats and that whole thing. Did you have to go through that?
Because I was a student when I was at the Lions Den, and then when I came over with Frank at AKA, I was just training with Frank, and I would just train together all the time, and I was already like a little bit older, and maybe a little bit wiser. So I I never actually went through like the Lions Den tryout, but Frank brought that mentality with him to AKA. And back in the early days, anybody that wanted to be a fighter and be part of the fight team would go through that. And one thing that we would do is we would do everything with them. So whoever was trying out, if they had to do 200 squats and 200 this and 200 that, we would do it all with them. So they could see that it could actually be done. And then, they would have, I think it was, we'd start like a round of wrestling, a round of boxing, a round of kickboxing, and a round of MMA. And they would, get various people in each discipline that was not a fun day for them.
Sure. No, for sure. Now, let's stay with the Lions Den for a little bit. There were some brutal tryouts too, and like I actually heard a story too that I think Bolander and Pete had to have a gym fight at one point to see who was going to be the first one of them in the UFC, and Bolander actually beat Pete. Were you at that? Was that something that you witnessed?
I wasn't there to witness it, but back in those days and the mentality there, that's no surprise, and Jerry was a super tough-minded guy, and like I said, I hit it off with all those guys. They were all great to me.
What was the old man like? What was is it Bob Shamrock?
Bob Shamrock. He was a great guy. I thought Bob was kind of like the godfather of the whole scene there, and would come in and check on everybody and be there daily, and obviously he had that background where he had the youth homes, and dealing with keeping troubled youths on the right path. And if you know much about fighters, that's a valuable skill when you're around fighters.
Yeah, for sure. The part of it too, you've mentioned Frank already. Frank is one of those, like,
yes,
like he was supposedly like first day at the Lions Den with like hair down to his waist and like a real street kid, a real. Did you see that part of him, or was he already progressed by the time you got there?
No, Frank was, by the time I got there, Frank was he'd already been the king of Pancrase and already had a lot of accomplishments.
Okay.
And let me tell you, back in the day, Frank was such an animal. He trained as harder than anybody, and was so driven and so mentally tough. He would push, if he wasn't in shape back then, like if he wasn't in a training camp, I've never seen anybody else do this. He would push himself so hard to, beyond exhaustion, beyond whatever, because he was, back in those days when he really wanted it, and he was training like an animal, he would push himself to where when he was done training, he would go into shock afterwards. I've never seen that with anybody else. like he would start shivering and he would get pale white and you'd have to wrap him up in blankets and
Wow.
like, and he would, take him about 30 minutes or so to kind of recover and come back to normal. Um, and I've never seen anybody else do that. I
Yeah.
mean, he had that mentality of like, well, I'm a racehorse or whatever, I'll run till I die. And that's, the mentality that he had back in those days.
Yeah, and it paid off for him because, back in that time period when he was in the UFC, he really was, you know, I could argue maybe Ruben Asado, but Frank and Ruben, maybe those guys were the first guys talked about as the pound for pound best fighter in the world, right around that era. So, um, why was he? What can you tell us about his rivalry with Ken? Because Ken and him are not brothers. They're not, physical brothers. They were both adopted and given the
Yes.
name by Bob Shamrock. Um, Kind of like, two of his prize students kind of thing, but they didn't get along at all. What did you see of that? Because it seems like Frank actually, um, I talked to him when I was at Bodog. I got a phone call from them and I talked to them, and they kind of wanted to do eventually something that wound up with them fighting. And I didn't know if it was going to be real or not, and I was worried about it. But I think now, looking back at it, they genuinely didn't like each other. What can you shed light on that?
Well, I think, I kind of stayed out of that to a large part. But, back in those days, I was much, much closer to Frank, as, we spent a ton of time together. And, I know that Ken had a little bit of a big brother,
Yeah,
situation with him. And, I know that they definitely didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. Um, but at the same time, I think there was also some mutual, respect on a training level and who they both were as athletes. Um, because I think, Ken Ken started before Frank. And so he was more advanced to start with, and he was a little bit bigger. So I think there was that learning curve for Frank to get up to speed, where Ken was the big brother scenario. And I think, they came from such a tough background and training mindset that, I think things were definitely a little bit on the rougher side, but we'd consider today.
now you mentioned that you went with Frank to AKA, and I remember I attended a lot of those early UFCs where Frank was champion, and then all of a sudden there was like another UFC where he starts to begin to show up with Maurice Smith, and then it seemed like Pete Williams and Jerry, like Ken wasn't around either. He was off doing his pro wrestling stuff, and it seemed like there was a real separation there. What really happened, or what caused that rupture? Especially with Ken not around, Frank would have been a leader. Why did he leave the Lions Den?
Well, I think he wanted to do his own thing. And I think one of the other aspects is I think he felt like his grappling was more advanced than where his stand up was. So I think he wanted to pursue um, getting his stand up to the next level. And that was, the trainings with Maurice, and then seeking out Javier. And then what became, his wife when he met Angie was also over here in San Jose. And women always play a big factor in our decisions. So his wife was, his future wife was up here also. Um, so all of those things I think were combined. But in hindsight, when he left the Lions Den, he had a big MMA team to train with. When he came to San Jose, he had boxers and kickboxers to train with, but not as much in the MMA side. A lot of times in those early days, it was just him and I. There wasn't that many other MMA guys for him to train with. And then there was he used to go up to Stanford, and he would train with this wrestler Todd Sermon, who was a really tough guy. And then another wrestler that he would train with a lot, that was an accomplished guy, was Eric Deuce, who was another really tough wrestler. So he would get tough wrestling from those guys, and wrestling in the Stanford wrestling room, work as stand up. Um, they're at American Kickboxing Academy with the boxers and kickboxers, and with Javier, and then him and I and whoever, what other jiu-jitsu guys, or he would train with whoever he could.
Now, wasn't there like an in-between stage for Frank in that um he went from Lions Den, then there was like a moment where he became part of a group called the Alliance with Maurice Smith, and I don't associate Maurice with AKA. And I think Kosaka was actually a part of that group too. It was like
Well,
Kosaka.
I think that was more in name value. Maurice Smith would actually come down to AKA and come coach and train a little bit, as he used to at the Lions Den. He would come down there a little bit. But I think that was on a day-to-day level. I think that was more in name value than necessarily daily training together.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, at the time the business was small, and Frank, um, probably wasn't compensated the way he should have been compensated for the level he was at, and that became an issue with him too.
Unfortunately, yeah, he hit the exact wrong period of time. He hit the dark period where it was like getting blocked on pay-per-view, and where there was all those struggles of when the UFC was, trying to cling to life. When he was at his prime and he was super driven. Uh, you know, Frank, to me, when I look back in hindsight, which is always 2020, um, he was so driven and trained harder than anybody that I'd ever seen, and probably still to this day, up until the Tito fight. And then once the Tito fight, he kind of, after that, he's like, I'm retired. And it was like the drive and desire completely changed. Like he was driven to be the best in the world, which he accomplished. And then after that, he retired for a while. And then when he came back, it was like, oh, I'll do a fight camp. I'll train for 6 or 7 weeks. And it was a totally different guy than there was the guy that was training for Tito and Pryor, where, those early days, I mean, he would train 24/7 like an animal. And, it was a night and day difference that I could see in his desire. He was like, oh, this is going to be a good paycheck. I'll come in for training camp for 8 weeks or whatever it was. But it wasn't the same guy and the same drive that I saw for the years prior, that was so hungry and so driven.
Okay, and that I think it's noticeable too because, I mean, Frank's a guy who has some controversial sides, and he didn't do that after post Tito period. He didn't do himself a lot of favors. Like he would negotiate fights, ask for an advance, pull out of the fight, things like that. I think Josh Thompson and him, they have a whole thing where Josh too, don't you?
Yeah, of course.
They got this whole thing where they really don't like each other. I think Josh thinks he stole $500 from her or something crazy like that. I don't remember the details of the story, but was that, you chalk that up basically to Frank stopped caring as much, overall? What do you think?
Well, I think that was more on the person. I think his challenges became like he wanted to challenge himself in other areas. I think he wanted to, pursue business and pursue other passions. And like I felt like he accomplished everything that he felt. He checked the boxes on the fighting, and so he had a different motivation. And sometimes that can be good, sometimes that can be negative. But I think I don't think we didn't see the best Frank after Tito. We saw the best Frank Tito and before.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, were you like, you probably were at because I think it was a Strikeforce fight at his fight with Renzo Gracie. Was that
Yes.
was that disappointing to you? Like, what was your feeling? Hey, or did you kind of see the writing on the wall before the fight? Were you already realizing things, weren't
Well,
the same?
I think wasn't it Caesar Gracie?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Caesar Gracie. Yes.
Yeah, I could see that, the difference in the desire and the training, and the motivation that he had at that point, compared to the desire and drive that he had, when he was fighting for all those UFC belts and stuff. Um, I mean, he was such an animal back then.
Now, around that time too is like he was with the UFC, like still with Art Davie and stuff like that. And Peretti came in, and Peretti is another guy with a big personality and likes things his way
Yep.
and stuff, and started bringing in Boss Rutan. And looking at some of the other athletes that he was bringing in, there was it almost seemed as if Frank didn't want to fight Boss. Is that possible? Is
Well, I
that
mean, when Boss, I mean, came in, he was in at heavyweight, and Frank was at the middleweight. That was, I think, when Frank was still fighting there was still basically the three weight classes. It was
yeah,
170, 200, and heavyweight.
yeah.
And then, I mean, Boss came in as a heavyweight. Where Frank was really a 85 pounder fighting at 200. Uh,
Yeah,
so, I mean, obviously they fought a couple of times in Pancrase.
legendary
But
fights.
I back in the day, Frank wasn't afraid to fight anybody. It didn't matter whether it was Brian Johnston in the gym or Paul Varlins or whatever. He would line them all up. He wasn't afraid of anyone.
Yeah. So you mentioned some old school names there. So those are the kind of people that were rolling around in those gyms in those areas.
Back in the day, yeah. I mean, in the early days, because Paul Varlins and Brian Johnston were already at AKA. They were kind of the two MMA guys. Um,
Okay. Now let me ask you this: now that you mentioned old school names, did you ever run across Red Herd?
no, I don't think I did.
Okay, because now he's a guy I actually got a chance to interview, and he's an interesting old school cat. He actually won one of those brutal Brazil tournaments. Got like a 25,000 bucks for it, and was like, "Hey, I can make money at this." And then he came in second in the next tournament, and the paycheck was like 5 grand. Yeah, so it's like, no, I can't make anything. You can't live on that. So, he learned early, but he was an old school guy that was pretty advanced. Um, let's take it a little bit. I'm going to jump around this interview here, but I recently saw you with Luke Rockhold in Abu Dhabi. This was just maybe 2 weeks ago. So you
Yeah.
were in Abu Dhabi 2 weeks ago.
Well, yeah, I was there, and Luke had called me up. I think he was doing a reality show out there for hardcore fighting, which is kind of like a Russian version of Tough.
Okay.
Um, and he was there filming that, and I think the Karate Combat uh, needed a main event, and they offered him a fight, and he was already out there, and he was like, "Hey, what are you doing? Can you come coach me for a few weeks to get ready for this fight?" I was like, "All right, I'll jump on a plane." So I was like, "I haven't been to Dubai yet, so it was you know it
Really?
was
This
it
was your
was a
first time there?
it was my first trip to Dubai. So I was out there for I think about 2.5 weeks or so, and we had a good time. We kind of checked most all the boxes there in Dubai.
It's a lot of fun, to be out there and known and sponsored and have some time and stuff like that for sure. But so what's the deal with Luke? Because Luke is one of those, more modern times. Obviously he's still competing and stuff, and he's another one of those hyper talented guys. But he started to take some knockouts, and we all do respect, but some of those knockouts you would have to think about retiring. Why would he still risk himself and be competing? And is he that driven as a competitor? You know, I don't think he needs the
Well,
money. He's got other things
you
going
know,
on.
I think it's always, it's a mixed bag. It's hard to hang him up. Um, I think, he'll kind of hang him up for a little bit, and then, he'll start taking care of himself and feeling better and start training again and get the itch. And, somebody offers him a decent paycheck, and it's like, well, okay, maybe I'll do this again.
Okay. All right. I mean, he's like I said, a hyper talented guy, but some of the knockouts were worrisome. Now, what do you think of his opponent in Abu Dhabi, Joe Schilling? He's a guy that, you know, just as a assessment watching from far away, he's a guy with a daunting, awesome reputation in the gym as a teacher, and it's never quite added up when he's actually competed. Have you gotten to train with
Well,
Joe? What's your assessment
I-
on
you
him?
know, I've never really had a chance to train with Joe. I do believe Joe became a Glory kickboxing champ at one point,
Okay.
and that's quite an accomplishment. And then the fact that this fight wasn't really an MMA fight, it was more of a, the karate fight. So there was very limited ground. I think the rules were, you could do a takedown, but you couldn't put both knees on the ground. The minute you put both knees on the ground, they would stand you up. So if you were going to do any ground and pound or anything of that, you had to be careful not to put both your knees on the ground. You
Wow,
had to
that is
have one
strange.
knee up or be standing over top of them. Um, so it was a unique situation. Joe was, we were definitely a little more in Joe's area of expertise by having it be a little more of a stand-up fight. And one thing, we kind of got there a little late, and we didn't get a chance to really do a walkthrough on the what they I think they call it the pit, with the slanted sides, and that was a little bit, a little interesting, because if you didn't pay attention when you back up, when you hit that angle, you trip
Yeah.
and you fall down. And if you don't, like Luke kind of drove Joe a couple of times, and the angle, if you walk up the angle, it's like all of a sudden the guy is so high above you, you feel like you're vulnerable where the guy could knee you or do, so it was a different experience.
Yeah.
Having the pit, but it was fun.
Cool. Now, okay, let's go back and do the interview right here then. Let's start with your career here. So you go back and it looks like you fought one of those old school tournaments in your first outing. Two fights in one
Well,
night, a
my
four-man tournament.
my first fight is actually not on the records there. It was a fight that was in Roseville, California, and it was so early that the California Athletic Commission came to observe what they were thinking of MMA, and it was more like pancration rules. It was closed fist to the body, open hand to the head, and then all the uh, elbows and knees and everything else was a go. Um, and I was originally supposed to fight Dave Camarillo, uh, because the idea at that time was the the best guy from Frank Shamrock's place versus the best guy from Ralph Gracie's place. And I ended up fighting a fighter from Cesar Gracie's place, and it was a tough fight. I think we ended up fighting about 10 minutes, and Cesar actually threw in the towel and it turned into mostly a stand-up fight. Um, and then the next one was what you were talking about. We went to, it was Reno, and then that was a fight that the Nevada Athletic Commission was
Was
going to
observed.
observe. That they were there, and I fought two fights in that night. Um, and yeah, it was definitely the early days. But one of the it was my first night that I fought on that same fight card was Tim Lachik, Eugene Jackson. I mean, there was a whole bunch of names on that one back in those early days that weren't even really names yet. That were a bunch of tough guys that all fought that night, and it actually I ended up being the main event versus the Shamrock versus Gracie thing, because they were a little concerned about the rivalry, like gym rivalry, if there was going to be any problems. So they figured they better put that at the end of the night. But then there wasn't.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned, that first fight with names. That's your second fight in Reno. Matyushenko, Joe Pardo,
Yeah.
John Marsh. It was also guys that would be, making an impact at a later date. Even Steve Heath, some good fighters back in that era. Now, were you already kind of beginning to adapt yourself to the coaching mentality, or were you just straight thinking about a fight career at this point?
You know, this might sound weird, but I never, at that time, there was no real money in any of this stuff. Um, so I wasn't thinking about it as a career at all. I was thinking about it from me. It was more like goals and learning and knowledge. In a lot of ways, I never really considered myself like a fighter as like my career. I that really wasn't my thought process at the time. It was more, I want to challenge myself, and um, more of a learning process and accomplishing goals.
Okay, and that makes sense. A lot of you didn't go down the path of like some guys back in those days, especially more in the Midwest too. But those guys would be like trying to get a fight every couple of weeks or every week, weekend, or like that, and just start $200 here, $300 here. That had to be the payday, but you were trying to build yourself up. Um, what? How long did you?
Because I think I came more from the traditional martial arts background. So for me, it was more like martial arts and improving my martial arts skills than looking at it as being a professional fighter.
Okay, so throughout all these fights that you did there, and we've gone through the first three there, you were still lumberjacking.
Yes, I was. It was either lumberjacking, or as things went on, I was do construction, or I do whatever to that I could do during the day that would allow me to come train at night. Um, and really, it was hard to imagine now, but it was so important to me at that time, to drive and make the sacrifices, and I reprioritized all my work and what I was doing to allow myself to train and to try to improve.
Okay, now you could see in those early days too, there were a lot of guys, and maybe was your goal like I want to fight in the UFC, even with these other smaller fights. That's also a
Yes,
bit of
no, it was definitely a box that I wanted to check, is going to the UFC. Um, and I also felt like I also wanted to showcase like all the work that Frank put into me too, because Frank spent a ton of time with me and coaching me, and was really actually was great to me. Um, and I wanted to showcase some of the work that he put into me also, because there was no financial. It wasn't like he was going to make a dollar off me because I wasn't making a dollar.
yeah, no, for sure. So now, as we go through some of these early days here, you wound up with a couple more fights. You fought that tournament, and you fought something called the Ultimate Ring Challenge. Got a quick victory there. Then you fought, and that's another show. Dennis Hallman was on that show. Jeff Munson was on that show. That
Yep,
sounds like you may have been up in Washington.
I was. Yeah, we went up there. I think I did that one like on a week's notice or something. We went up and fought up there, and Yeah, no, but I mean, yeah, I think Munson was on that card. It was a whole bunch of people that, those were the early days, but coincidentally, it was like so many of those early guys, when you go to these small shows, became prominent fighters.
For sure. Munson, and Hallman, Rich Guerin was
Yep.
another guy who was one of their guys up there. Um, I've interviewed all those guys. um, now you get that was in '98. It looks like you took 6 months off from the tournament, and then you did that fight, and then you took another 6 months off, so you can see you're putting in the time trying to get the growth. Like you're not rushing into fights, and then you get into something called the IFC Warriors Challenge against Shannon Rich. Now, talk about your Shannon Rich experience, because Shannon is one of those guys that, um, at times he's got varying degrees of motivation in this. You know what I mean? He's got
Yeah.
tons and
And
tons
this
of
was, I
fights.
think, yeah, pretty early in his career still. And I think he was still a little more serious about it at that point. And this was a little bit like, I was busy. I didn't really spend any time on the internet. I'd never seen Shannon Rich. I didn't really know anything about him. All I knew was what Frank had told me at the time. He's like, he's got a lot of fights. Uh, he's like, just don't let him get going. And that was like Frank's advice to him. He's like, just don't let him get any momentum going. And and I remember in that I started fighting, the bell rang or whatever, we started, and I remember what Frank telling me that, and like Shannon came and he like threw like a high kick and the crowd went ooh ah, it was like in the air, nothing, and then he like threw like a leg kick, the toes like just flicked my leg, and the crowd's going ooh ah, and I'm thinking, am I letting him get going here? And I'm like, damn it, I got to do something about this. And I remember, I think I must have loaded up and threw the hardest punch in the world. And uh, I threw the punch and I missed Shannon Rich and I hit the fence.
Oh,
And I was like, I was just like thinking, man, I'm doing exactly what Frank told me not to do. But then right after that, it was over.
yeah. He's that's a good. Now you're an undefeated guy, um, with Frank in your corner. And at some point, right after that fight, you do get the call for the UFC, and you fight, I believe, a Tito student named Tiki Gosen. Maybe
Yep.
not a Tito student, maybe a Tito training partner, but he was definitely associated with Tito. What do you remember about how that fight came about first? Who called you? How'd you get
Well,
in there?
originally, Frank said, "Hey, we finally we got a spot," and it was going to be Frank Trigg. So I was
Oh,
supposed to fight Frank Trigg, and I had that. I had a pretty long, good training camp for that fight, and Frank Trigg was a southpaw wrestler, so you know all my training partners were southpaw, and everybody was working to take me down, and I was working on escaping submissions, getting up. So a completely different style of fight. And then I think Frank got injured, or whatever it was. I don't know. Um, and they called and said it's Tiki. But at that point, like my training was essentially done already, and it was like now I was fighting a right-handed stand-up fighter, so completely different style of fight. I hadn't been working on any takedowns, and I mean, obviously I won, but I can't say that I was happy with my performance there. I felt like I could have been much improved. Uh,
okay.
but
Okay, you got your win now. You never went the distance in a fight. You finished all your fights. Um, at this point,
I think three by submission and three by KO or knockout or TKO.
so yeah. So at this point, you're starting, as you said it a couple of times. You're checking off boxes here. Um, did the UFC call you back, and what made you that was your last fight? Like you stopped
Yes.
fighting, and was it the fact that, all right, I fought in UFC, that was my goal, and next fight's 2-2 again. It's not worth your time. I'll just go do some other things, or why
Well,
what happened there? What was going on?
there was a couple of factors. Um, One was, I had a eye injury early on, doing construction that was prior to ever fighting.
Okay.
And so I had a cataract lens in one eye, so not the greatest vision on that side. Um, and when I had to go to a couple eye doctors to end up getting approved for when I would. My last fight was the first fight we actually really had to do any medicals for.
Sure.
Back in those days, you just showed up and fought. Um, and when I spoke to the eye doctor, he was like, he made me think a little bit. He said, it's not about something happening with your bad eye. He's like, what if something, you get a detached retina or something happens to your good eye? Then what do you do? And that gave me a real thought process of a reality check on, I had kids and married and responsibilities outside of just, doing what I wanted to do to entertain myself and accomplish goals. Um, so that weighed heavy. And then I think Peretti called Frank back and offered him a 3-fight deal. And I think it was exactly like you said. I think it was like my first fight in the UFC was 2,000 to show and 1,500 to win. And then I think the 3-fight deal was 2-2, 3-3, and 4-4 or something. And really, I didn't really care about the money. That wasn't ever a motivating factor for me, because I made good money when I was working. So if if they offered me the 3 fights, I wasn't interested in just 3 fights. But if they would have said if you won the first 2 fights and you could have fought for the title or something on your third fight, or if there was a step in those early days of this is what you do and you could fight for the title, that would have enticed me to be interested to accomplish the next set of goals. But just 3 fights for the sake of fighting, I wasn't really that interested.
Okay. So you still the motivation and the doctor thing. Now you said you had a wife and kids.
Yes.
How'd your wife feel about these 6-hour commutes to go train?
You know, uh, she was pretty understanding. We had a little small ranch at the time, and she had horses. She had things to keep her occupied, chasing the kids around the yard and the rest of it. So she was actually a pretty good sport about all of it.
Okay. Now I'm gonna ask you kind of a personal question. Are you still with this woman?
No, no.
Okay. Okay. Well, it happens.
Yeah.
I think you met my wife. I'm not with her anymore either. So
It happens.
so it happens. But yeah, it's kind of a crazy lifestyle. But she put up with you in those early days where you earned the name and stuff. So you decided to turn down the 3-fight deal.
Yes.
Now,
And I think Peretti said that you're the only person at that point in time that ever turned down a deal to fight.
yeah, yeah, no, but I think kudos to you. You like I said in the beginning of the interview, you earned the name Crazy Bob because of a reason, not because you're actually crazy. Because that's a good thought process that you put yourself through there, and you made a good
You
decision. But you
know,
got
the next thing that happened in terms of that, so I what I considered retired, but I loved the training, and so I still continued doing everything and training and trying to improve and working on those. And then it was years later, after a few the tough shows, Dana called me and said, hey, we're doing a comeback show of the tough show of all the comeback fighters. I think it was with Shoney Carter and Matt Serra and all those guys. And he called me up and I said, well, give me a week to think about this, whether I
wow.
want to do it or not. And I went into the gym for that week, and I went in instead of just training for fun. I went in with the mindset of I'm going to be a fighter again, and training that week. And I was like, and the pressure and the stress that I put on myself, I was like, this isn't fun. So I called Dana up, and one of the other factors, so it was two things. It was, I put super high standards on myself of, the moment I ever agreed to a fight, I had that mindset. I trained 7 days a week. It was like I had to take it easy, not to train, at least take one day off. So I put a tremendous amount of pressure on myself to perform. But then the other thing that I did, and this was at a time when, we were growing the team and I was managing people. And the other thing that I thought is, as the sport was just blossoming at that point, it was after it was a couple of tough shows in, and everything has just blown up. And the management had gone from a hobby that I was doing where I was working full time to, after the first, UFC tough show, where the management became a full-time job. I had to stop working and, just work on, managing athletes and training them, because everything just exploded overnight. And that growth, I had to think, I thought, if I spend the next year, between tough and fighting, what is that going to do for me? What is that going to advance me? Or while this sport's growing, am I going to advance my life and position and what I'm doing and accomplishments more by focusing on training and management, or is it going to advance me more to go and fight again? And I made the decision between the pressure, stress, and nerves of fighting and that lifestyle, or, trying to make my challenges in the next one of producing fighters and accomplishing my goals as a coach and manager. And obviously, I made the decision, and I don't regret that decision. I think it was definitely the right decision.
For sure, for sure. Um, always a manager with a good reputation. You always also, face it, you had access to a good talent pool of people too, so
Yep.
there
Oh,
were
that makes all the difference in the world.
for sure. Because the crazy part is, it looks like it was probably, if the tough offer came, let's say 2008, around there, you've been off and not having fought for more than 8 years. Also, that's a lot of time to be laid off, and you already gotten your management started. I used to joke with Monty Cox that, Monty would have 3, 4 fighters on a UFC, and he'd be the highest paid guy because he's grabbing a percentage from each guy.
Yeah.
So you probably had to factor that in, that management was good, because that UFC contract for those tough shows was like $500 a week for the filming. And then the contract afterwards pretty shitty also. They touted it as $100,000
But
contract, but it was like 8 fights.
it was at a time, though, that I also realized that, I had a good relationship with Dana and Lorenzo, and was starting to have enough guys that where I was working business deals with them, and realizing that the guys that were performing well for them, the contracts didn't matter that much. They were paying bonuses and taking care of the guys well, behind the scenes.
Okay. Okay. So let's take it back here. So you're retired from the UFC. You're sinking your teeth in it. You're still going to the gym. Um, who was the first guy you managed? Who was the first guy who said, "Bob, I want you to manage me"?
I think the first scenario with that was probably Bobby Southworth.
Okay.
Because he
No
he was
slouch.
yeah, he kind of had some managers that were doing things, and I was going to the shows and helping coach with him and working with him all the time. And I was like having to deal with all the logistics of everything. And it was like, this is a pain in the butt, and I'm doing everything. It's like, I might as well be managing these guys. And and at that time, Frank had moved down to LA and was pursuing his career down there. And then I got, connected with who became my long-term partner, Dwayne Zinkin, on the management that helped recruit all the wrestlers. And, but yeah, no, Bobby Southworth was the very first guy.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. I know Bobby. Bobby came down to Costa Rica for one of the big Bodog shoots.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that in a little bit. But you've now mentioned two guys that I always associated with you, and it's kind of like a trio of people that really did a lot for the sport. And one is Javi Mendez, who I believe was the gym owner and is kind of like the genius behind the stand-up of the fight and stuff, even though obviously, he's grown to be more than that. And then Dwayne, I believe Dwayne brings the lawyer aspect of it and the business aspect of it.
He was also a college wrestler himself. And so he had a lot of relationships in the wrestling world, and from coaches to athletes, and, helped feed us a lot of the, from John Fitch to Josh Koscheck to Cain Velasquez to Daniel Cormier to Mike Van Arsdale. He brought all those wrestlers in that we helped transition into fighters.
Okay. So he became a pipeline of there. I thought he was a lawyer. He is a lawyer though, right?
No, he's actually not a lawyer. His dad and his brother are, but
okay.
The family has a big business office, so there's lawyers in the office and accounting and everything, and so it there's so yes, he brings the legal side, but he's not a lawyer himself, but we're using the family assets for the legal.
Right, but that's a huge help too, because
Yes.
You could be out there alone, meaning well and doing all the right things, but get taken advantage of. And at some point, he was a good ally to have that allowed,
Yeah.
I think
Well,
AKA to
I
become
think
what AKA is.
It was between all those pieces of the puzzle, it worked.
Yeah. And talk a little bit about your relationship with Scott Coker too, because Coker was at Strike Force, and you said here at around some point that Dana and the Fertitas and everybody had a good relationship with you guys and stuff. But Scott and you were pretty close as well, and Scott seems to always be a rival of them. How'd you manage to navigate those waters and stay on the UFC's good side?
Well, I'm sure there was times when it was challenging, but Scott obviously was a San Jose guy, right? So he would come to the gym all the time, and over the years, I definitely became close friends with Scott. And actually, back in the Strike Force days, there was Rich and Mike Kogan, and like a fight team. And Scott valued my opinion, so I actually worked and helped put my 2 cents in on Strike Force back in those days. But it was it was the early days of everything, so but it was definitely a dance. But I tried to separate the roles, and not mix them.
Okay.
To try to do the best job that I could in each, for the guys that were in the UFC, and then the guys that I had that were in Strike Force, and not play one role off of the other.
So it's not easy for you. Were you officially John Fitch's manager?
Yes.
Okay, so now John is a guy that at the same time with other teammates, getting love from the UFC, never really saw any love from them. How do you manage that in the gym kind of thing? Or, John's a motivated athlete. He actually fought a few times for us when he was still back in Indiana, in the early days and stuff. He was a 205 pounder, but um, he became something else. He became a really
He's
special
back
guy.
to a 205er right now.
I like good for him. But you know, what were your conversations like with the UFC? Because it had to come a point where you had to say, look, the winning streak, this, he got one shot at St. Pierre. At the end of the day, St. Pierre is where he is on the list of all-time greats kind of thing. Just taking him to 5 rounds. I think he lost all 5 rounds, but not
Yep.
everybody made it to 5 rounds with St. Pierre. He, after going back and keep winning and stuff like that, you would have expected him to get another shot. What were your conversations like with them trying to get the job done for Fitch?
Well, I mean, there's many aspects to this business, as you know. Um, there's the entertainment and show aspect too, and they want to have, you got to win, but you also got to be, a little bit of a showman, and Fitch got, it was a long road for him to get there to the top, um, and he did, and GSP, was the reigning king, during that whole time, and uh, he definitely, one of the greats of all time. Um, but when Fitch trying to work his way back, it obviously, he had a rough night when he fought GSP. It was, I remember that night and us fighting and going in between rounds thinking, am I going to have to stop this fight? And every time I would talk to John, because it was brutal. I mean, it was a rough night. And every time I'd go talk to him on the stool, I could tell that he was still hungry to fight. So it was like, he still wants this. So, well, let's go. Um, but it was one of those. There's not been too many times that I've cornered where I'm thinking, I might have to stop this fight, but there's been a few of them, and that was one of those nights because it was a rough night.
Yeah. No, but like you said, Fitch is a competitor. But how does it feel? And like you said, he was a wrestler based. He obviously works on his stand up and stuff, but the wrestlers sometimes get that boring reputation kind of thing. Um, John's also kind of, I don't know, quiet or mild mannered. Like he's not, gonna Conor McGregor you on the microphone.
Yeah.
How do you go back to him with that message? Hey, the UFC doesn't like you.
Well, and I don't think it was a matter of the UFC doesn't like you. I think it was a matter of, the UFC is looking to promote the biggest, best fights they can, and also what they think is going to sell. Um, you know, and sometimes that's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah. Now, and Fitch, checked up on other options. He had you working the phones. Is that how does that work out with calling other companies, trying to get other fights and things like that? That's your job
Well, I
too,
mean,
right?
eventually, yeah. I mean, he ended up, coincidentally, he went vegan for a little bit, and that wasn't too good on his career. Uh, and then he strung a few losses together, and then I think we made the transition from that point to PFL, I believe,
Okay.
and then he became the PFL champion. Um, and then they were going through some transition for a period of time where he was sitting for a while, and then during that transition, John was like, they're like, oh, if you wait a little more, and I actually was for him at the time, waiting, because he was the champion, and they were starting those $1 million tournaments. I was like, hey, hang out here, and you can win $1 million. And he was like, no, I want to go challenge myself in Strike Force because they're waiting, and I want to go challenge and see, because Rory McDonald was there, and a bunch of those guys. He's like, I want to challenge myself there and see if I can, win the belt there. And because he'd already had the belt there, and so he made his run there, and fought in the tournament, I think it's uh, he had a kind of a little bit of a controversial like draw or whatever with Rory McDonald. They had a hell of a fight. Um, but yeah, no, it's been a challenge, and Fitch has always been very principled, and a lot of times he he made the decisions more on principle than he did for the dollars and cents.
Now, and is it hard to motivate a guy after the UFC to go to some of those shows? Are those shows noticeably a step smaller at that, especially at that point?
Well, in Fitch's case, I don't think it ever was. It was for him, it was, I think Fitch was always pretty goal orientated too and wanted to challenge himself and win titles and of course make money, but there was more to it than just the money for Fitch.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you. We'll get off the subject of John and bounce around to some of the other fighters you've managed because there's been so many. Um, were you with Fitch at the Jeff Jocelyn fight in
I
Canada?
think that was up in Canada. Yeah, I was.
What do you think of that fight? Because that, I don't know, I watched it recently and there are some funny details on that one, including
Yeah.
that John kind of was the you Jocelyn was the hometown guy, and John kind of got the benefit of the doubt with the judges. I'm not sure on that one. What's your memory of that fight? Other than that, it was a
I mean,
fantastic fight, and Jocelyn's a pretty good guy too, huh?
it's been a really long time, but the thing that really stands out to me in that fight was Fitch was fighting and he got blasted in the mouth. And he said he felt like his lip was hanging off of his face. And he came back to me and he said, how's my lip? And I'm like, you're okay, you're good. And so he didn't believe me. So he like called the timeout and asked the ref. That was the controversy there. Because
Yeah,
he was just thinking, Bob's gonna just tell me whatever I need to hear to keep fighting. But yeah, so anyway, he got back to work and um but I just I don't remember it all that well. That's the part I remember, and I remember it was a really close fight. And it was a rough one.
well, yeah, it was definitely. I look back at that fight, and it is a testament to Fitch, but to Jocelyn as well, because they both left it in the ring. You know what I mean? And I'm sure they weren't paid for the effort that they actually put in. A lot of guys would call it
Yeah,
in
I don't remember what it was, but I'm sure it wasn't much back then.
and a lot of people, you got your lip messed up, call it a day. Jocelyn had gotten his nose broken and he was bleeding all over the place. And a lot of the times, even some of those fights might be stopped by the current way they go and stuff. And those guys,
Yeah.
they fought a full 15 minutes, and both deserve a lot of credit for the fight. But John,
Another one that always I think about and I laugh with Fitch was we went down to Mexico. I think it was Juarez, Mexico, and he fought an 8-man tournament in one night at 185. And we were fighting in a cockfighting ring that they put a cage in the middle of in Mexico. And it was some good memories.
yeah,
And I think he fought 3 fights that night at 85, and I think to win the tournament that night was $1,500.
yeah, yeah. No, Fitch is definitely a guy who paid his dues. Um, he's probably got 50 official fights that are out there already. You know what I mean? So yeah, a lot of those trips to Mexico, they always have a story. And um, you know, like you said, Fitch is a pretty principled guy, so managed to stay out of trouble in Mexico. I've heard stories about guys, you don't want to go to Mexico with Andy Anderson, put it that way. So the guys always tell wild stories from down there. So let's move on. One of the guys you talked about was Southworth. He was down at the Bodog shoot in Costa Rica, and there were a couple other guys there. I always kind of rated your guys very, very highly, obviously. You had Cain Velasquez down there. Um, Southworth was, like I said earlier, no slouch. Um, but then there's Daniel Puder.
Yes.
So Daniel, he had a run in the WWE where there was some controversy where he may have done some type of shoot or work shoot or something like that, but that he had gotten a catch on Kurt Angle, and that kind of made his reputation. He came over. He was well paid for his MMA fights, especially for the time at least, and he got it in terms of personality and things like that. But like, whatever happened to the guy? He nothing ever amounted to him, and I almost feel like he was a heavyweight and checked off a lot of boxes in terms of that stuff, but I don't think he was going to be able to hang with like the Canes and the Cormiers. He wasn't that level of guy. What's your take
Well,
on him?
he didn't have a high level wrestling background. He wrestled and he was a good athlete and he had the opportunity to train with all those guys. But I'm going to say he had a severe case of like ADD. Like you could never keep him focused on any one thing. He was always had 10 different projects going on, uh, taking them all different directions. And I think that's actually what went wrong with him with the WWE also, I think he was just too all over the board for them. And as you know, in this business, if you're going to be a fighter, you got to focus on fighting, and it's got to be your number one priority because it's probably the number one priority of your opponent. And
Yeah.
if you're in this business part time, this is not a healthy business to be in if you don't take it very serious.
Did what did his career amount to in MMA? What did he do after the Bodog fights?
You know, I think he ended up with like 5 or 6 pro fights. Um, I don't think he ever lost, and I think he just went off to other ventures. And I'm not exactly sure what he's doing right now.
Okay. So yeah, you talk about ADD. So he didn't make it in the MMA game. He really didn't make it in the WWE. I remember part of his story was he was telling people in the future he hasn't run for president yet either, has he?
No.
So yeah, he was one of those guys that maybe a little more sizzled than steak. But yeah, he was an interesting character, but he didn't stack up with Kane. And I remember,
Well, not a whole lot of people did back then.
yeah, and I'll tell the story. You brought Kane down to Bodog. I think it was his second fight. He had already fought once. We got him in there with a Matt Lindland guy, another wrestler. Um, but you told me before that fight, you told me this guy's going to be a world champion, and I hear that from a lot of people. You know what I mean? A lot of people bring me the next guy or that. It was back in
Yeah.
those days and stuff. But you turned out, obviously, you knew what you had there with him. And I remember we spent 2 weeks down there in Costa Rica doing the shoot. Was it in Costa
Yeah,
Rica?
that was such a great time. I think Kane was with us down there. He didn't fight. I think he fought in the St. Petersburg show, but I think he came with us down there as a training partner. Because we had a whole bunch of guys on the card. I think we had Trevor on the card, we had Cooter on the card, we had
Southworth.
Southworth on the card, and we might have had one other person. I don't remember,
Yeah, there's
but
a
yeah,
170 pounder I keep thinking of. His name is escaping me, but it may or may not have been
I
yours
don't
as well.
remember, but we had a whole pile of guys on the card down there, and that was actually one of the best couple of weeks in the fight business that I
Yeah,
ever had.
we had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. But what I remember about Kane is I don't think I remember him kind of like he had a backpack and sometimes he had his hood up. But I don't think he watched. He was an observer, but he was quiet. He never said 2 words to me the whole time. You took care of the business end and stuff, but he never. I don't think.
Well, he was a pretty shy guy actually, and was very very business orientated, and it takes a while for Kane to kind of get to know you before he gets comfortable and starts joking around and having fun. But before he kind of knows everybody, and especially in those early days, he was definitely pretty quiet and shy.
So when you told me that this guy's going to be a champion, how fast was it after you saw him that you figured this out? And you put your hands on him
I
too, right? You roll around with him in
Yeah,
AKA
no,
at some point.
I'm gonna say right away. I mean, within the first week, um, there was a couple things like his competitive spirit, his level of athleticism, and then the other thing was his ability to learn. Like he learned and picked up all aspects of the MMA like faster than anybody I've ever seen. Like he would learn whether it was jujitsu, whether it was stand up. Like you'd show him something and you're like, oh, you've been practicing that for years. He he picked it all up like he was born for it.
Okay, so here's a question.
And then he had that incredible drive and incredible cardio, that was just such a weapon.
Yeah, now, so what happened in Mexico City? What, because if you would have told me, because I'll be honest, like if I remember the fight with Werdun now outgassed him, and that
Yeah.
you would never have gotten anybody to bet that before the fight. You know what I mean? Not Kane.
You know, it was interesting situation. I think Kane came in 2 weeks early. I think Verdum was down there for 6 weeks. And I want to say the arena was at 87 or 8,800 feet,
Mm-hmm.
which is so high. And a few of I think the elevation affects different people differently. I remember that fight starting, and about 2 or 3 minutes in, I remember going, "Oh my God, Kane's tired,"
Wow.
and that was just something you just didn't see. And I remember that also that night, Gilbert Melendez, who was also somebody that was known for a huge gas tank, he friggin' ran out of steam also. And I think I don't know whether it's guys with a big gas tank that were used to fighting at lower elevation and they set a pace that was unsustainable, that you're not used to it, or like I said, I think the elevation, like I used to work logging up in the high country all the time, and for me being in the high country was never a problem. uh, but then you take somebody else up in the high country and they get altitude sickness, they have headaches, they feel lethargic, they're tired. So you know, that's different for different people, and it definitely did not suit him well.
Yeah, and just for perspective too, Denver is the standard mile high city, with like football players all talk about the effect,
Yep.
basketball players all talk about the effect. Mexico City is 2,000 is like a half mile higher, you know?
Well, from my experience, like at about 3,000 feet, 4,000 feet, you can just start to notice a little bit of a difference. 6,000 feet, like Denver, you definitely notice it. Now you go to 8,800 feet, it's a world of difference. I mean, that's really high.
Yeah, and Werdum also had the advantage of um he was doing the UFC's Spanish language broadcast. He's Portuguese. He speaks Portuguese and Brazilian, but he does pretty good in Spanish. He lived in Spain for a long time. He was doing their Spanish language broadcast and had lived in Mexico City periodically. So he knew he was going to fight there to get there. And hey,
Yeah.
he's a pro, and he caught Kane that day, but that was one of the biggest surprises. What did that do to Kane motivationally? Like, because at the end of the day, his career kind of came to an end mainly because of injuries and stuff. He couldn't keep, the injury bug at bay. But did that motivate him? Was he like looking for a Werdum rematch? What was the thought processes there?
Well, that was also the last fight that he was with me from a management standpoint. So, I became a little less involved from that standpoint moving forward. So I can't quite address some of those as well. But one of the big factors with Kane, everything becomes really hindsight when you look at, it's just like when we look back at like Mark Kerr, for instance, and what a monster he was. And then you watch the Smashing Machine, movie, and then you go, oh, now that makes sense. Why these things were occurring at those times. And like with Kane, for instance, he was fighting injuries and surgery after, injury after injury. And training ended up transitioning into trying to make it to the fight and be safe than pushing yourself, to an extreme. And I always like to use the race car analogy. If you're not willing to practice at a level where you're willing to go into the wall, you're really not ready to compete anymore. You can't practice for the Indy 500 and be out there going laps at 55 miles an hour learning the course. This is a business where that doesn't work. You've got to be willing to go with reckless abandon to be at the highest level.
Gotcha. That's very interesting. Now, what did Kane versus Cormier look like in the gym?
Well, I think some of that depended on like who was in fight camp. Of course, early on, Kane was so much further advanced than Daniel. Every day was a rough day for Daniel. It was. I remember early on, we were back at the old gym, and all of our sparring was in the ring instead of the cage. And I would stand on the apron, and I'm coaching DC, and Luke had switched from being a right-hander to a southpaw because he felt that suited his style better. And so Daniel thought he was going to get fancy and start playing around with that. And he was in the ring with Kane, and I'm like, you better knock that shit off. Kane's going to fuck you up. And so he's standing southpaw, and he gets head kicked right in the nose, rear kick right to the nose, and and it's like right over in my corner, and his nose is gushing, and he turns to me and he looks at me, and I'm like, I told you so. It's like, get back out there and stand right. Yeah, but yeah, no, Daniel had a lot of rough days, and it was sink or swim, and Kane was a big part of Daniel's success in it was literally sink or swim every day. He had to learn to compete with Kane, or it was like go do something else. And those two guys really helped each other tremendously on get to the next level.
Now with Kane, it seemed like he wrestled in college. I think it was Arizona, right?
Yes.
Okay, so he had wrestled in college, but then was still relatively young coming into MMA. Whereas Cormier had already was a mature man,
Yes.
transitioning. So that kind of makes what he's done all the more impressive, So what were your thoughts on him? And then take us through him weight cutting, because there's always that controversy of, I think in the Olympics, I think he had to make 208, and he had his
and he missed it.
And he had his kidney shut down, and like actually I either didn't compete or didn't go as far as he expected to because of the weight cut. And then now you add to that he had to make 3 lesser pounds than that. What kind of magic did you work on it? Because I also feel like the older you get, I look at the example of Pat Miletich, whereas Miletich making 170, he ended his career at 185, but making 170 the last few times he made it, he had some brutal bad times. The older you get, the harder it is to cut, it seems. So, what magic did you guys pull with Cormier to get him to 205?
Well, with him, obviously he's not the most disciplined person when it comes to food. And I think he saw this as, really his opportunity to accomplish some serious goals. and he brought in people to cook for him and monitor his food, and that process would be several months. It was a fight camp, but it was also a weight cutting camp. I mean, he would lose massive weight during fight camp as he was training to prep for those fights, and really, it was impressive that he was able to train as well. He was able to, considering the amount of weight that he was losing in the process.
What was the heaviest he fought at?
In terms of heavyweight or
Heavyweight.
205?
Yeah, when he was a heavyweight.
I think his best weights were around right around 245, I think.
Wow.
Was about where he was, at his best. 247, just a little bit under 250.
That, I mean, to get to 205 from there
240.
though, that's extremely, extremely difficult. So, still already about 20% of your weight at that size. So
Yep.
it's crazy stuff. So what do you think of Cain in his prime versus Daniel in his prime?
Well, I think you never know. But I think, Daniel is a little more explosive, and obviously Cain had that incredible cardio. So, you could probably say, early in a situation would probably favor Daniel a little bit. Later in the rounds would favor Cain.
Okay. Very interesting now, but because right now on the pecking order, like I got to the point where I still think Cain is probably, when you look back at the Lesnar fight, for example, where, I think that was, a lesson that he taught. He just shot a lesson there. I think you're talking about the best heavyweight that we've ever seen. You know what I mean?
He was certainly one of them, certainly one of the most well-rounded, and I mean, obviously, I think the world of a prime Fedor back in the day. I think the world of a prime Cain, and really, Daniel at heavyweight, and the earlier part of his career, and as he was, it was a race for him to get the skills before he was aging out of the sport, because he started so late. To get him to that high level, skill set wise, before he got too old to compete.
Now, so what's your take now with the AKA, basically a super gym? What's your take on Khabib and the Russians, that spent some time over there and also have risen to that elite level? What did you see with those guys?
I think there's some common things over the years that you see with the guys that become champions. And that is, they prioritize it. It's the number one thing in their life. They don't have any holes. They fix their holes. They fix their weaknesses. Whatever they're the least good at, they're working to fix. But they're good on the ground. They're good on the stand-up. They're comfortable fighting everywhere, and also fighting smart. But every guy that has become a UFC champion, really the thing that I think sets them apart the most is the seriousness and the drive that they have to push themselves to the title. And all those guys, it's like you probably got to hold them back from training because they're so motivated.
Okay, and so what did Fitch against Khabib look like in the wrestling room? Because Fitch is a little bigger, he's a good wrestler, but Khabib, most people are going to say he's a better wrestler.
Well, Khabib's wrestling was in the room, when it, especially not necessarily maybe in the open mat, but once he got you into the wall and fence, it was second to nobody. his uh, his ability to wrestle and compete, and really like he shined and had his own system figured out once he would hit the wall, that he could get takedowns on anyone. I don't care who you were.
What's your most memorable moment in the gym? Like the one story that you find yourself telling and remembering just fine, whether it's a good one, a bad one. What do you remember the most? Because, like I said, it's a super gym. You guys went through.
Well, I might take you back to the early days that when you talk about Josh Thompson, like Frank never really cared for Josh much. He didn't think much of him. He didn't think he was tough. And I was like, Frank, don't, I'll deal with Josh. Don't worry about him. He'll be, I'll take care of him. And Frank would Frank would always kind of bully Josh a little bit in those days, and because he didn't think he was tough. But you know, Frank only saw it from his perspective of working against him. Frank would compete at 200 pounds. Josh was a 55er. Um, but I saw that Josh was really tough, of course. But one of those early days, Frank caught him in a guillotine choke, and they were standing, and Frank choked him out with the guillotine choke, and then he like stood him up, and Josh was standing out cold on his feet and like a tree, face planted into the mat. And
Oh,
that 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 was definitely one that stands out in my memories over the years. But I mean, and back in those days, Frank had that mentality of, if you got caught in an arm bar or submission or whatever, and that was one thing to tap to, but you didn't tap to chokes. So we all got choked out plenty back in those days.
that's funny. Yeah. Now let me ask you this: we haven't talked about maybe my favorite AKA guy, and that's Trevor.
Yes.
And now Trevor becomes one of those guys that, with all these other guys like Kane and things like that, Trevor is probably 220. So you training in the gym, you got another huge body, another super talented guy who got himself down to 185. Where do you put him on the pecking order with guys like uh, you know, Luke Rockhold and some of the other guys that you saw at 185 also?
Well, Trevor was kind of getting the tail end of his career and a little long in the tooth when Luke was coming in and kind of getting going. But Trevor once again was as mentally tough as anybody that ever stepped foot in the gym. He would always have a little bit of a cardio issue, but he would just gut it out through his toughness. But I've Trevor's one of the guys I've always been, super close with, and has always just been a great guy, and was, one of the guys that came into this a little bit older and a little more mature. He was definitely, a man that was competing in this, not kind of a kid that was kind of learning the ropes. And you know, I Trevor had a great run with you guys in Bodog and was the Bodog champ and had some classic fights, and he had a lot of wars over the years.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, and sometimes
I just spoke with him last week, actually.
yeah,
We
he gave
stay
me
in
your.
touch.
It's funny now that I look at it. You still have the same phone number you had 15 years ago. That's the phone number I used to
Yep.
call. I remember it. But he hooked me up with your phone number and stuff because yeah, Trevor's a guy who's always going to be dear to my heart because it seems like AKA also had good guys, like in terms of
Yeah.
as people, because Trevor's a good person. Um,
We
most of the
we
guys,
had we had a pretty small group of guys, and we were all, relatively close. And I think, we tried to keep a good environment between all of us to help each other, and all mutual goals. And I do agree with that. Like, everybody was pretty close. Everybody was a bunch of good guys. Hey, Dave, could you get me a charger?
Cool, cool. Because Trevor is a guy that I remember. Like, he's like, I got to go down to AKA. They need me for a training camp, and putting the camp together and stuff. He'd come in and put in the work with you guys, and then obviously you guys, when he had a fight, he fought only top guys for us at Bodog, including the Yuki Kondo fight, which to me was, one of the fights I was proudest of making, because getting Kondo out, I think he was a great competitor. Probably, um, he. I wonder if he could have made 170, especially when you compare him to Trevor.
Well, another thing I think that, Trevor once again was a guy that had responsibilities. He had a wife and kids and homes, and for him, he came for training camps, and for over the years. And it was one of those things where I don't think he was able to truly realize his full potential as if he was a full-time guy that could have dedicated completely and lived in the gym like everybody else at the time that reached the highest levels. I think he could have definitely been one of those guys had he been able to make the sacrifices to just, focus on training full time, 24/7 with the elite level guys. I think, we didn't ever saw quite the potential that he could have reached had he had that ability to dedicate himself to, the full-time gym instead of just training camps.
Yeah, I agree. Up in Idaho, he just doesn't have the bodies that you guys do in
Yeah.
there. Um, well, so and the other thing about Trevor is that he had kind of almost, I don't know if bad luck is the right word, but it's like there were a couple of things that I'll mention to get your take on. Like, why did Joe Silva not like this guy? Like, what's not to like? And then the other part of it is he went 2-1 against Chael Sonnen. I just saw a video where
Yep.
Chael said he made like $8 million for his Anderson Silva fight. Me and Trevor talked about him fighting Anderson Silva. I would have given him that fight. I would, and he would have, if Chael, but going back to the Chael thing, he's 2-1 against Chael, but loses against him in the UFC on the biggest stage. It's like a
Yeah,
little
he
bit of
lost
bad
to him in
luck.
the
What
one
happened?
yeah, he lost to the one that matters. And I mean, luck plays a big factor in this whole business. I mean, one of the most talented guys I've ever worked with, nobody ever knew because he never was able to make it to a darn fight. But he would go, and he was an 85 pounder that would be training with Kane and DC and giving them rounds. He was too tough for his own good because he was trained with those heavyweights and he'd get injured, before his fights and so forth. Where really he should have been just smashing the smaller guys, and looking out for himself. But he was a great guy, and was so tough. He liked the challenge of working with Kane and DC. But
Wow. What's his name?
you know,
Come on.
it was Jimmy Zimmerman,
Okay.
and he was he wrestled, and he also had an amateur boxing career where he boxed in a bunch of the finals for years, year after year. But it was just a super tough guy that really understood how to use his distancing well in the boxing really well, and was super hard to take down, and was just another tough minded guy. But every time we get a fight scheduled or get something to get going for him, he some injury would happen, or some that bad luck would strike, and it just you know never came to fruition. And he was a guy that could have definitely competed at the highest levels, but luck plays a big factor in this whole game.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's start to wrap up here a little bit because I've had a lot of your time and you're already calling for charges and stuff. So I deeply appreciate it. So what was your biggest, like, the biggest fight that you were worked with or around Were you at UFC 100? Were you, but DC's title fights with Jones? Um, you know,
You know, to me, the I look at the highlights in my career as a coach and manager, and really more so as my I felt like my accomplishments as a coach was, you know, the first UFC title with Kane, Kane beating Brock. This was a Kane that was a guy that we took that was living in his car outside the gym that, came and moved in with me and lived with me for years. And then, went on to become, and beating Brock Lesnar, who was larger than life, and winning the heavyweight title. That was one. And then the next one to me where I really felt like I checked all the boxes and accomplished everything that I needed to accomplish was with DC becoming the double champ. That moment of winning the 205 and then going up and beating Stipe, um, that was the next. I'm going to say, that was certainly a highlight to what I felt, was my accomplishments. And this is one of the replica belts of DC here on the wall behind,
cool.
that was from that fight. That was definitely one of the, proudest moments of my career in the MMA world and business.
So let's talk a little bit about DC and his kind of rivalry with John Jones. What's your take on John Jones? Obviously, he's a talented guy, great fighter and stuff. But he doesn't seem like a nice guy. Like he doesn't
Well,
like. Well,
being a nice guy is not necessarily a requirement in this business. I, for whatever you want to say or not say about John Jones, one thing that I think, I hate to say it, but, I would definitely say he's the best that there's ever been. For him to have essentially an undefeated career with a controversial loss through to DQ. I mean, the guy, every time when he needed to suck it up and get going, he has. I mean, he's been so impressive from that standpoint, and his mental fortitude to get through the tough fights when he needs to, and to accomplish and be at the top of the game for as long as he has been is so impressive. Of course, he's got, Astros by him of all of his controversies, but, you can't take away from what he's accomplished. And,
well, and I
you know,
appreciate your.
and I'm going to also say, even through the rivalries and everything else, John's always been nothing but polite to me. He's, even though we're competing and fighting and emotions and everything else, I'm not going to judge a guy. I mean, obviously he's got a lot of other stuff, but I'm also going to say at the same time, I've got a lot of respect for him as a competitor, and he's been nothing but polite to me.
Well, but don't you? Do you ever dream? Do you ever feel like for example, like okay, Kane, his career was cut short because of injuries. No, there's not much you can do. Like with Trevor logged his 50 fights. Maybe he didn't get as high as he could have because of the training camps and things like that. But with Jones, he could easily have 6 or 8 more fights if he had been like with an AKA and somebody who could guide him through some of the rocky points. Whereas, I won't mention their name, but the super gym he had seemed to lack the balls to put a stop to some of his crazy stuff at some point. Would the combination of yourself and Zinkin and
You
Javi
know, it,
have been enough
it,
to
it's
corral him?
that's hard to know. That's hard to say. Um, I always feel, you want to lead by example, and I always had a, most of all these guys. Daniel lived with me. Kane
Okay.
lived with me. You know, so many of these guys, Koscheck lived with me. So many of these guys lived with me over the years, but also like, I think, you set an example of, the way that, you should act and, and behave is part of it. And success doesn't just come in the ring. I'm not doing my job. You need to be successful in the ring and hopefully also successful in life. And we don't always succeed in those things. They can be mutually exclusive,
Yeah,
but
John.
ideally, you want to be successful in both because there is more important things than just our little fighting world.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but it's always interesting because he's already getting a GOAT status kind of guy on most lists, and you kind of wonder, we
And I'm one of those that give him that status. I think he deserves it.
well, I'm going to ask you about a fantasy fight here in a minute, but we also didn't get his full potential because he spent years on the shelf because of silly stuff, and then maybe not great negotiations going, his way or not his way with the UFC. But like I said, we probably even short a good 6 or 8 fights of him, because
Yeah.
of one reason or another. And you know, if you don't think he's the best now, 6 or 8 more fights logged at a high level like that probably would have sealed the deal with almost everybody. Well, what do you think about him against Fedor in Fedor's prime?
Well, I mean, that would have been very interesting. But I think Fedor versus anybody in Fedor's prime, he was so explosive. You know, his speed and explosiveness. I mean, he was just so fun to watch, and he'd sit out there and bounce and then explode. It was like, he definitely had potential to knock anybody out. It's super hard to say on these guys that were also talented in their primes. But Fedor, I believe in his prime was as dangerous as they come.
The thing about Fedor too is, like you said, with the hands and the power, he threw everything with conviction and stuff like that. But I've gotten a chance to look back at some of his fights and stuff, and his ground game is very underrated. Even though we know he comes from a sambo background and things like that, you know, uh, he could compete. He wasn't going to get put away on the ground by anybody either. And I'm not sure if Jones has quite reached that level of dangerous. And like, I think top game wrestling, Jones.
Well, I think one thing that uh, I mean, for all Fedor's strengths, I think one small weakness that he had was, if he ever ended up on the bottom in terms of, the ground and pound situation. He had all those years fighting in Pride where the ground and pound wasn't as dangerous because there wasn't the cage and where you'd get stuck in the elbows and those, other elements. It was a different, a little different set of rules where obviously, I think the Pride focused a little more towards creating the action and the big ground and pound moves and the stomps and the kicks. So it wasn't that it was any less dangerous; it was just a little different. Where with the cage, you ran a little more risk of getting stuck on the bottom. We saw him over the years get in trouble a few times on the ground in the cage fights where he didn't have those issues necessarily so much in the ring.
And do you think some of that factor was that by the time he got to the States and was fighting there, he was already past his prime?
And that may have been part of it, but uh, when I think about him and Jones potentially, obviously, I think he would, Fedor would have the advantage on the feet, but I think if Jones got him down and there was in a cage situation, not the old Pride ring, where Jones could have, Jones has got some vicious ground and pound too, and he's very, both guys are just so dangerous in so many different ways.
Okay, so now we've been talking about those guys. Who's the best little guy you've seen ever? Like, because I consider you a guy that has seen it all. You know what I mean? From the very beginning, I think we've gotten just a little taste of it in this interview. And if I wanted to, we could probably go another 5 hours talking, but I'm going to take it easy
Well,
on you.
when you say the best I've ever seen on a little guy, um, do you want to ask from a skill standpoint or from their performance and their career standpoint? Because I
Oh,
think those are two different people.
okay. Well, let's go over both of them.
Well, from a skill standpoint, the early days with working with BJ, he was unbelievable talent. Um, and this might, him being, this might sound crazy, but him being a two division champion, being a 55-pound champion and a 170-pound champion, when you look at his career, I still think he didn't reach his potential of what he was capable of, because he was one of the most talented guys that I ever seen, from the stand up to the wrestling, which he didn't even have a wrestling background, but he had unbelievable wrestling, to obviously his jiu-jitsu game. Um, you know, I almost, it sounds crazy, but in some ways he underaccomplished what he was capable of, because he was so talented. Um, and then from the performance of where the career, obviously for the smaller guys, I gotta hand it to Khabib. I think his mental determination, his desire, drive, training, cardio capacity, and probably some of that also probably came from growing up in high elevation. His VO2 max, Khabib had a gift like Kane had a gift, in terms of, he had a gift of cardio. Kane has that gift of cardio. Um, and, Khabib is one of those few guys. I mean, he can step on the gas pedal for 5 rounds, no problem. I don't care who you are, he'll run you out of gas. He's had an unbelievable gas tank. And, he grew up, doing this. His dad was, his coach throughout his whole, life, until his dad unfortunately passed away. But he had such a major influence, and Khabib grew up, in the martial arts, in the combat sports, and was just born, bred, and raised to do this, and had that warrior mindset, to the degree that it was no surprise for him to become champion. You can see the mindset that just sets these guys apart.
See, now it's interesting. BJ and him, it comes down to those two in your name. I remember the first person I heard BJ's name from, and that he said he couldn't believe this guy's level of talent that you had to watch out for, was actually Frank Shamrock. That he had
Yeah.
Wild Frank was one of the first people, and for Frank to, Frank wasn't easy with the compliments, especially when he liked to
No.
joke around and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So, but to hear him talk about that, I actually I sent Joey Gilbert to fight BJ in his first UFC fight. Joey was my guy,
Yep.
and
Okay.
so we kind of learned early. You know what I mean? But
Yep.
I think one of the things that separates BJ and Khabib is that Khabib avoided, like, maybe BJ was too much of a natural, because, like, I think BJ, I'll say it. I think he enjoyed pot and Hawaii and things like that. And Khabib didn't have a lot of those vices or anything like that. He managed to avoid that
He
pitfall.
he had no vices. He was all business all the time, completely focused on the job and the training, and that 1,000%.
Now, and with BJ, I remember being in Atlantic City for one of the early UFCs in Atlantic City, and as you mentioned, there was a transition period where all of a sudden now there's commissions and testing and things, and he was like, "Wait, they're going to test for pot?" Like, he was like, "Oh shit, they caught," like he was worried about it, and at that highest level, you got to kind of think that might be the difference, or could be a little bit
Yeah.
of a difference. How would you, like, if BJ was focused and ready for a fight like he was against Hughes? Him and Khabib would have maybe been one of the all-time great fights if they were both in their prime. We
Well, I think Khabib is a grinder. BJ was an explosive tactician. I mean, he was, phenomenal on the ground, dangerous on the stand up, and just as his skills, overall skills were just phenomenal. But of course, you got Khabib that had the giant VO2 grinder mentality, wrestler mentality, and it was two different mindsets of it was like BJ would obviously be super dangerous early to anybody.
Yeah.
And the Khabib will wear anybody out. So
very, very interesting stuff. Bob, man, I'm very glad to have caught up with you. Like I said, I feel like we could just keep talking. I could keep bringing up guys, and just to pick your brain is a treat for me, because I always respected your perspectives. I learned a lot from you in the past when we talked. And I'm kind of cocky about my spot here. I don't say that about a lot of people, but with you, with all due respect, you were always a guy that, like you said, you knew you had your goals set, your mindset, and you were always somebody that when you talked, I wanted to listen to what you had to say. From the Kane situation where you called his championship and things like that, to the guys that you bought for me, to the insights and things. Much respect. Just an amazing to catch up to you and talk to you again, man.
well, I try to call it like I see it. Sometimes I'm not always right, but as much as I can, I try to shoot straight.
For sure, for sure. I'm gonna, let you go, even though I don't want to. But maybe we can catch up and do things here periodically. One of the segments that we've had recently is that we'll go back and watch an old fight together, maybe, and that way I could probably get you for maybe 5 or 10 minutes at a time without chewing up all
Okay.
your time and stuff. So maybe
Well, you definitely jarred some old memories that
that's what it's about. That's what it's about, because if we don't tell the stories and we don't get some of that stuff on paper, or on video and stuff, it's going to be forgotten, because you know most of the stuff that went on that's outside the UFC is already getting forgotten. So that's what the MMA museum's about. I think it's important to catch up to people, and like I said, I think the prerequisite isn't fame, because you're not a famous name like people talk about Bob Cook and stuff, but in terms of fountains of knowledge, um everybody in the fight game knows you and respects you, and that's not an easy thing to do. Even John Jones likes you, you said. So definitely a
well,
lot
I
of respect.
appreciate it.
I appreciate your time, man, and I'll send you a link here on contact when this goes up. It'll probably be about 10
Okay.
days.
All right.
All
Sounds
right.
good.
Thank you, brother. I'll
Thank
talk to you
you.
soon. Yes, sir.
Good talking. Yep.
Yes, sir.
See ya.
Bye-bye.